Not knowing how to use your plugins well can be the difference between a good beat and a bad beat. In today's video, I'm going to show you 5 plugin tips that you need to know to help you make better beats. Now, whether you're using stock plugins or paid plugins, there are some common features that you need to know that can really help you take your beats to that next level. So let's cover them. Tip number 1 is macro modulation. This can be a huge game changer when you're using presets or even building your own sounds from scratch. For every plugin that you have, there are lots of different parameters that you can use to change and play around with your sounds, as you already know. But the people who make these plugins and presets will often choose a handful of parameters that they feel are the most important for their presets, the ones that will have the biggest changes. And these are often found in their own little area in the plugin. It's basically a quicker and easier way to experiment with your sounds. These are typically called macros. For example, if I go into Flex, which is a stock plugin for FL Studio, you can see that we have this little area right up here, and you can see it's called macros. And if I use this preset, you can see it gives me a bunch of different parameters that I can use to play around with my sound. And if I were to go into a different preset, different parameters are going to come up. And the same thing if I were to use something like Expand, which is a paid plugin that I recommend to most newer producers. It's just very inexpensive and has a lot of great sounds in it, but you can see up here as well, this area has different parameters for different presets that you can also play around with. Now, why is this helpful? What can this do for us? Modulating these macros can be a quick and yet powerful way to improve your beats. For example, let's take a listen to how this Fender Rhodes would sound if I didn't modulate these macros. It sounds pretty straightforward, nothing too great. Now let's hear how this sounds after I decide to modulate some macros. You can hear this is a little bit more interesting and the sound changes over time. It just helps it sound a little bit more engaging and not as repetitive. Now to do this, let me show you what I did here. After I selected this preset, I played around with these macros to see what effect they had on my sound. You can hear what this low macro does. It increases or decreases the lower frequencies of my sound. Now that might not sound like a big deal, you can definitely do that with a straightforward EQ, but the difference is if I were to right click on this fader, and I either edited the events or I created an automation clip, this is where things can start to get interesting. What I'm going to do is draw out a pattern for what I want this macro to do. And you can see if I were to play this as an example, this macro, this parameter here will now start to move over time based on the pattern that I create. For anyone who watched my video on stock plugins way back, you know that this is a big reason why stock plugins can sound a lot more cheap. More expensive plugins have presets that already do this type of modulating automatically, so doing this for yourself if you're using stock plugins is going to be especially helpful. In this example here with my Fender Rhodes, what I did was I went into the LFO section right up here, and I created an LFO to modulate this macro. And then I went in yet again, I selected some different areas of this modulation, and I created an entirely different LFO for that section. And that's how I was able to get that nice wobbly feeling with this sound that changes over time at different rates. And by the way, if you want a more full walkthrough on how to do this, check out the video that's right in the corner. So you can see this can have a pretty big effect on your beats. Your sounds will become more rich, and your beats can end up sounding better if you just do this one extra step. Tip number 2, this can have a big difference, and yet so many people overlook this. Let me again play this Fender Rhodes pattern. Now let me play this again, but I made one small change here. This almost feels like an entirely different sound at this point, and I didn't play with any of the macros or any other parameter. Something that you might not know is that depending on the plugin or the preset that you're using, the velocity of your notes will change more than just how loud a sound is. When you program your drums, for example, if one note has a lower velocity than another, then it's just going to sound quieter. But for certain presets, the velocity of a note will control more than just its volume. You can at times create an entirely different sounding texture depending on the velocity, just like you saw here. And this is going to be especially important for the producers who point and click to produce. I really recommend taking advantage of this. If you point and click all your notes in, they will all be programmed to have the exact same velocity. So it might be a good idea to take that extra step and play around with the velocity of your sounds to see if it creates any difference. You might be missing out on some really unique and interesting textures that may fit your beat a lot better by not experimenting with your velocities. And using varying velocities of all your notes like you see here throughout your pattern can help you create something that just sounds a little bit more live and not as stiff. Some producers will recommend that you just use the randomizer and just crank up the velocity dial here. But I think with how much of a change this can have in your beats, being a bit more hands-on and deliberate with your velocities can be a better idea. Tip number 4 is reshaping. Again, this is something that can be very simple, but yet it's overlooked really often. This is going to be especially useful for improving your bass and making sure your bass lines fit. Pretty much every plugin gives you the ability to control the shape of your sound, and this is something that you will need to use in order to make sure that your sound works within your beat. For example, with this beat, I have this big subby bass right here. But had I kept this preset as it was, you can hear how this would have sounded. The bass ends abruptly as soon as we get to the end of the MIDI note, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This would be perfectly fine in certain situations. But being able to control and reshape all of your sounds to better suit whatever beat you're making is going to be an important step to improving your beats. For one, the release knob or fader is going to be very important. This is how you create that long tail just like you heard. Or you can really truncate your sound if you want it to end abruptly. Not controlling the release would be like me not cutting my video clips so that certain clips end up running longer than they need to be, while other clips will end up being shorter than they need. So you can see this is going to be a very important tool when you're trying to add sounds into your beat that actually work. Playing with the attack can also have a pretty big effect on your sounds as well. This can be especially useful for layering and putting sounds more into the background of a beat. And finally, tip number 5 for using your plugins better, we have retexturing. If you're unhappy with your plugins and you're thinking of buying new ones to get better sounds, try to see if using creative effects that you already have can help. I'm sure you're familiar with very typical effects like EQs and reverbs, but you can also use other effects that can more drastically overhaul your sounds. For example, here is one of the sounds that I tried to introduce during the hook of my beat. And at first I did not like this, but listen to this sound after I used hardcore, which is a stock effect that comes with FL Studio. This sounds completely different, and if I were to go through the different presets within hardcore, I can get some pretty drastically different sounds that I could play with. If you ever find yourself disliking your presets and it feels like you can't find anything that sounds unique, there are always effects in your library that can help you with this problem. Multi-effects tools can be great for this. These are VSTs that apply multiple effects onto your sounds all at once, so you don't have to fumble through trying multiple effects yourself. You can just do all of this in one go. Your DAW probably comes with at least one of these, but having a couple of these in your library is going to be very helpful. With how big of an effect these can have on your sounds, it's almost like multiplying how much presets you have at your disposal, since you can recolor them in multiple different ways with these tools. So I definitely recommend experimenting with these plugins. So those are 5 tips that you can use with your plugins to help you make better beats. If you've enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Head over to betterbeatmaker.com if you're interested in joining my full online beatmaking course. The link to my free drum kit, as well as a link to the Discord to join my producer community, is in the description box below as well. And I'll see you guys next time.